Our next speaker was one of the most versatile general officers of his time. Major General Earl Pecks started his career in fighters, moved to bombers, and during the Vietnam War was Chief of Special Air Operations at MACV headquarters. After that, he became the base commander here at Offutt, and as you well know, in those days being the base commander was really a trying job, trying to keep those 15 to 20 general officers and their wives happy, as well as running the largest base in the United States Air Force. He was the chief of the Air Force History Office, and in a 5-year period in the late 1970s, General Peck was the SAC DCS for Personnel, the DCS for Operations, and the SAC Chief of Staff. His last assignment was Director of Intelligence and Space Policy in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense. Please welcome Major General Earl G. Peck.
Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. It's one of those occasions where you wish your mother and father could be here. Your father would have enjoyed it, and your mother would have believed every word. I am, in fact, delighted to be here. I should caveat that by saying, however, that having flown some of the early jet fighters in the Air Force, within some cases with an average engine life of 35 hours, not by design, but the way it worked out, I'm, in fact, delighted to be anywhere. I was asked to reminisce about my days in the Strategic Air Command, and particularly those on combat crews. What comes to mind when you think about those days is those were the days. And in fact, we thought they would never end. And I mean that at several levels of abstraction. We thought that alert duty, USCMs, ORIs, CEG, Chrome Dome, et al. Would go on forever, indefinitely. They, in fact, sometimes seemed interminable. We did not foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union or the end of the Cold War, at least not in the way that it happened. With all due deference to the apologists and revisionists of today, the Cold War was real. We were not simply adversaries, as some historians describe it. There was a moral distinction. And it's not true, as one of the spokesmen for this administration said, Western policy toward the Kremlin during that period was a grotesque exaggeration based on a paranoid fantasy of an imaginary threat to Western Europe. This is a key figure still in the present administration. We were not paranoid, and we did face reality. When we reflect back on that time, when we thought those days would never end, we can also wonder in a very real sense whether they, in fact, should have ended. At least some aspects of those days should not have ended. Today, without SAC as a proponent, the Air Force, for the first time in its storied history, does not have a single long-range bomber on the drawing board. To me, this is a perilous circumstance, for I believe that strategic bombardment, long-range aerial striking power, provided, and I'll use Dick Lawson's word, the raison d'etre, not only for the existence of SAC, but for the existence of an independent Air Force as a separate service. The demise of SAC and the absence of near-term plans for a new bomber are attributable, at least in part, to the mindset of the leadership which has emerged from Vietnam. I don't say that disparagingly, believe me. After all, we just came from Langley, where we pinned a star on our oldest boy, sent him off to Saudi Arabia, an F-15 pilot, to command the Air Expeditionary Wing at Prince Sultan in the desert makes me cringe when I think that little boy is now running the war in the Middle East, but I'm sure it's in good hands. And in fact, I spent much of my career in fighters. First in Fellbrook, the world's greatest air base, and Bitburg in F-84s and F-80s, instructing at Webb in T-33s, fighter pilot's dream. Air Force decided they had to educate a fighter pilot, sent me to the University of Texas under an AFIT program. And while there, after finishing, I was drafted into the Strategic Air Command. I had orders in hand already to go to Baghdad by the Sea, Hamilton Air Force Base, California, to fly F-104s for ADC, a fighter pilot's dream. 10 days before I was to leave Austin, change in orders. Proceed by way of Stead, McConnell Air Force Base, Kansas, medium bomb aircrew training, aircraft commander B-47. I arrived there with a number of other disgruntled fighter pilots, and all of the co-pilots given to us had just finished F-86 training at Nellis. But I do have to say, in retrospect, it was not long before we came to a full appreciation of the importance of the mission to which we had been assigned, and an appreciation for the professionalism, rigorous discipline, and training standards of the command to which had been assigned. And I submit that for many of us, that is the point where we decided what we were doing was worthwhile and we would make careers of the Air Force. And we did. So my first SAC job was in reality as Aircraft Commander B-47, Pease Air Force Base, New Hampshire, the 509th Bomb Wing, with all of its great history. B-47 had some unusual characteristics, as General Doherty alluded to earlier. It sat on the ground in a nose-high attitude, rolled in a nose-high attitude, took off in a nose-high attitude, and landed the same way. And unlike a T-6, there was no such thing as a wheel landing. You put the front truck down, and you were airborne again, very rapidly out of airspeed, altitude, and ideas. It also had high swept wings, so that any yaw produced a roll, which was called roll due to yaw, so that behind a tanker, it was sometimes difficult, if you were not gentle with the throttles, to reduce gyrations. But the dangerous part, we learned, was on takeoff, we lost an engine, outboard engine, between S1 and S2. And the only reason I think we survived was that I saw the RPM going down and stuck the rudder in, and we staggered off the ground, taken off northwest at Pease, which means the terrain is rising. And the navigator said later he would have ejected, except you may recall the navigator ejected downward in the B-47. We staggered around and finally got it under control, headed back toward the coast to get some altitude. And the command post said, well, what's more, you had 5 more engines. What was the problem? But many years later, at Homestead, in B-52s, the B-47 wing commander from Pease called me and said, we've lost 3 airplanes under those circumstances since you took off that day. Would you testify for our action aboard about the difficulty encountered? And in fact, it proved that it was difficult to solve even in a simulator. So once again, I'm delighted to be here. Same characteristics that I described for refueling were exacerbated by the fact that we were, in the early days at least, refueling with KC-97s. And I recall one instance which will adequately describe it. We gave the tanker a formating speed of 218, and the last time I saw the airspeed indicator was reading 193. And as we fluttered down through the overcast over northern Canada someplace, I decided after that that I'd keep a sharper eye on the airspeed indicator while I was behind a KC-97. Alert was a way of life in those days, and we were on 1/3 alert to start with, which meant 11 days a month for the average crew in the alert shack. We went from 1/3 alert to 50% alert, as nearly as we could tell, with no increase in resources. We went from 11 days a week in the alert shack to 16 days a month in the alert shack. But surprising, except for the grumbling you might expect from anybody in that circumstance, everybody seemed to appreciate the importance of what we were doing, and morale was surprisingly high. One good aspect of that whole operation was that, you may recall, we reflexed bombers to garden spots like Nuasor and Sidi Slimane and Rabat, but we went to Torrejon. And Torrejon, most of you probably know, is Madrid. So the week off between 2 weeks of nuclear alert in Spain was a week in Madrid, which made it all worthwhile. Some of you will remember that they had a SAC incentive system at the time. You earned points for RBS runs, ECM runs, refuelings, nav legs. We were the SAC crew of the month 4 months out of 6, the wing crew of the month 4 months out of 6, because we had a navigator and co-pilot could figure out the mathematics of the problem and how to solve the game. Before I leave Pease, I want to mention that while a captain, when I got there, Jim Keck was the vice wing commander of the 509th. He later became the base commander. They made me the project officer of a group of visiting dignitaries. And as the dignitaries came through the line, they met me and the base commander and the division commander, A.J. Beck. So they'd come through the line, they'd meet Peck, Keck, and Beck. And they thought we were kidding them. That really wasn't true. But as a reward for all this, when they were building a new B-52H wing down at Homestead, they picked crews from Pease and Plattsburgh and Lockburn, maybe someplace else too, as a new cadre of a B-52H wing with no B-52 experience whatsoever, except for 2 crews which came from Loring from G models. And that was it. The rest of us were straight from B-47s into B-52s. Ground school in F models at Castle. Roswell flying training in an E model. A G simulator, because they had no H simulators in those days. And in fact, you're going to find this hard to believe, they sent me and my co-pilot to Langley to fly a 106 simulator, because that was the only instrument panel similar to the panel in a B-52H. But given the fact we only had 2 knowledgeable crews when we got there, I became, I think, the lowest time IP in a B-52 in the history of the world. I was an IP with 100 hours in the airplane, which was remarkable in those days. During October 1962, and that date may ring a bell with some of you, they sent us to Wichita to pick up a 61040, which is the last B-52 off the line. And while there, we started to return to Homestead, and the DO, Paul Poland, said, "Don't bring that airplane here. Don't come here." So I always did what the DO told me. It didn't matter. I always did what the DO told me. So we sat there. The SAC rep there at the plant kept telling us to get our butts off the ramp, because it was costing SAC $30,000 a day for us to sit at Wichita. I said, "No, my DO told me not to go, so I'm not going anywhere." So funny, he said, "SAC orders you off the ramp." So I called Paul Poland. He said, "Okay, take the airplane to Wordsmith." So we took off 5 minutes of 12 one night to avoid another day's $30,000 rent, and went to Wordsmith, and we're shooting patterns up there in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. ILS is at Wordsmith, Oscoda, and the command post says, "You're ordered to land." And we didn't know. Okay, so we landed. They put us in a motel, and came around and got us at 6 o'clock in the morning and said, "You're supposed to be on alert." Now, I couldn't imagine how we could land at Wurtsmith, be put on alert, with no EWO package and no training, and not knowing where we were relative to the targets. So that was an exaggeration. We really didn't go on alert, but I found out only in a news broadcast there when Jack Kennedy went on television and told us about Castro, and the reason we couldn't go back to Homestead was pretty obvious at that point. But anyway, Paul Poland finally told us to get into 135 and go back to Homestead to get another airplane and leave 61040 on the ramp there at Wurtsmith. The wing commander up there, that 379th, was P.K. Carleton, who tried to convince me I couldn't leave because that airplane is the one with the automatic flight control system, both for refueling and everything else. He said, "Nobody else knows how to operate that, so you got to stay here and check out my crews." I said, "No, my DO told me to go to Homestead. I'm going to Homestead, regardless." Then we returned to Wurtsmith and flew airborne alert, November 1962, out of Wurtsmith. We used the same targets en route which we had out of Homestead, which meant we added about 2 or 3 hours to the mission, flying in the eastern Mediterranean on airborne alert. Is the mic still working? And I guess the most interesting thing about that, I'm not sure it is it? The mic is not working. He says in the back he's got his thumb up. This guy wants to trade places with you. One of the things about that was Soviets had ships in the Mediterranean, trawlers, which would attempt to jam your communications and your EPN 69 signals. So sometimes it was pretty sporty finding the tanker in the Mediterranean. And also, if we had big headwinds coming back across the Atlantic, I think we're cutting in and out, we would refuel to the maximum. We were carrying a couple of air-to-surface missiles, and we refueled to what was ostensibly 488,000 pounds, but maybe a few pounds more to make sure we got across the Atlantic. One day we had 180 knot headwinds. Ever been behind another B-52 at max gross weight in flight? Well, the wings are like this, and it's scary because you know your own wings are like that. General Jack Catton was the division commander there at Homestead at the time, and he was indefatigable, as many of you know. He liked to fly with our crew. One night, I remember we took off 11 o'clock at night, flew a full mission with refueling, low-level, RBS runs, hound dog runs, everything else, and dropped him off 7 o'clock in the morning in Orlando, where he had another wing. And the staff of the other wing there, maybe 306 maybe, or one of those, was out there on the ramp in dress uniforms and everything, and General Catton climbed off the airplane in a flying suit, and he went to work. While we took the airplane back to Homestead, he went to work a staff visit at Orlando. I always thought that was remarkable until I found out that's what you had to do. But those of you who flew H models know that you set a thrust gate. You didn't use full power on most takeoffs. Set a thrust gate to use the power you needed. Well, that day, those guys had ancient D models or something up there in Orlando, so we were going to show them. So I told the co-pilot, ignore the thrust gate, let's use full throttle. As we left there with 70,000 pounds of fuel in a B-52. So we left there going like this out of Orlando. When General Catton got back to Homestead, he called me in and he says, kind of shining your ass, weren't you? Other than that, he never said a word about it. I think he was proud of us. General Al Gillum, who was here, he may be in the audience, succeeded Jack Catton as the division commander. We were the first H-wing to pass an ORI, and General Gillum got up and was gracious enough to credit the victory to Jack Catton, but he also cautioned us about being too smug about having gotten through an ORI. Old Chinese proverb, he says, the higher you climb up a flagpole, the more your ass shows. Well, it was mentioned that I had spent some time here in Omaha. So after crew duty, I was drafted again out of Homestead to come up here as a major. And they said, 1 week after I got here, they said, go down and brief General Power on this subject. And I said, okay. And they said, we want to tell you one thing, though. The last guy we sent down there never came back. He was fired. Fired? Well, what do you mean fired? Fired from the headquarters, fired off the base, fired out of the command, and that same day he was down in Galveston, Texas, in the CAP. With that note, they sent me down to brief General Power. Fortunately, he liked me better than the last guy, so it worked all right. One of the things that we were impressed with even more after flying B-52 crews was that the professionalism, the competence, the rigor with which crews approached the job really made it successful, really made it possible that we survived the Cold War. One thing I think has not been mentioned and should be mentioned, there's another factor in there too. In the early days, there were no positive locks on the nuclear weapons. We were out there as a 6-man crew, and it all depended on the integrity of the crew and its professionalism. And I think that's a tribute to the training and the people produced by the Strategic Air Command. Through it all, we did the job. We successfully deterred war and contained Soviet expansionism. Many years later, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, standing on the Neva River Bridge in what had been Leningrad, and realized that at one time had been my aiming point for a 1.1 megaton weapon. It gives you it's an incomparable feeling to be in that position. But it wasn't the use of the weapon that was important. The fact that all the people in the Kremlin knew we would if they did the wrong thing. That's what makes it perplexing for me that we apparently now believe, given the expected service life of the aircraft and the anticipated attrition over the next few years, the inventory of 95 B-1s, 21 B-2s, 71 B-52s will be adequate to meet the national requirement for 130 combat bombers through the year 2037. That we believe we do not need to define a requirement for an aircraft to replace long-range strike platforms until 2013, nor begin producing the follow-on until 2034. And because the B-2 signature meets operational requirements today for survivability against today's air defenses, we don't need any improvements in signature before 2015. So it appears that the Air Force will do virtually nothing for the next decade, or the decade and a half, to improve both nuclear and non-nuclear roles for bombers. It now seems, and this is the amazing thing, we're planning for an unprecedented service life for the B-52H of 84 years. It's a strange thing. As I said, I picked up the last one at Wichita, 1962. 20 years later, my son Jeff was flying the airplane at Fort Worth, same airplane, and he's got a very young child, looks like a pilot to me, who may be flying that same airplane 15 years or 20 years from now. Fortunately, Congress is goading the Department of Defense to do a little more than that. And it's not surprising to me, given the success of the B-2 over Kosovo, given the small numbers and relatively small number of sorties, it dropped a disproportionate number of the weapons and did a disproportionate amount of the damage, notwithstanding the Chinese embassy. Okay. But a B-2 combined with JDAMs, GPS-guided munitions, flying out of Knob Noster, Missouri, can do a hell of a lot of damage. And we may rue the day when we depend on air bases other places in the world rather than the contiguous United States. I should mention, before I go on to the final thought I have, I mentioned that I've been rescued a couple of times. The Air Force did a better job of managing my career by accident than I could have done on purpose. When I was leaving Vietnam, I had orders to go to Pease, back to Pease, to be the DO, or the 5-length bomb wing again, now with FB-111s. And I thought, here's a magnificent opportunity for a guy with both fighter and bomber experience to use that. 10 days before I left Vietnam is when I got the orders to proceed to Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, as commander of 3902nd Air Base Wing. In that case, I believe General Holloway rescued me. If you review the early experience of the FB-111 in ORIs, not many of those guys survived. They didn't pass one for several years. Maybe I could have, but it's dubious. And I was languishing with the air staff when General Doherty rescued me from Washington to go back to SAC in 1975 and serve successively as the DP, DO, and Chief of Staff. And I'm grateful to you, General Doherty. You always have been. I'd like to leave you with one final thought, if I may. The days we thought would never end were characterized by one overarching quality, which you'll probably hear many times today, and that is professionalism. And the professionalism which proved to be the hallmark of SAC eventually permeated the entire Air Force. And I think we can attribute our success in Desert Storm and in the former republics of Yugoslavia in great measure to that increased professionalism throughout the Air Force. General Mike Short, who was the proximate architect of the victory in Yugoslavia, was at that ceremony in Langley, which I attended, and he made a point which I think should be heartening to those of you who spent a lot of time in the tanker business. He said there are a lot of distinctions between our Air Force and other Air Forces, but one great distinction is the tanker force. Nobody else has that kind of capability. So when you're thinking about writing to your congressman, as General Lawson suggested, and I would too, think about this. The tanker force is aging rapidly. Despite re-engineering, despite the existence of some KC-10s, it's aging, and that creates problems. More airplanes in depot, more modifications have to be made just so civilians allow us to fly in the same airspace. But military aviation in general is in what you could describe as a death spiral without more capital infusion. Because the older the airplanes get, and they're all getting older, the more time they spend on the ground in depot, the more dollars you spend per flying hour. So they're spending money for flying hours we can't spend on new equipment. There are those who would sacrifice the F-22 in order to get a new manned or unmanned bomber. I don't think we want to ask anybody to go to war in 2015 in a F-15C or in a B-52 in 2015. Regardless of the caps on the budget in Washington, we need to spend more money on procurement today. The improved professionalism throughout the Air Force, to me, represents this. In a very real sense, The days we said would never end will never end. Will never end, and all of you should keep that in mind and work at it. Thank you very much.